I'm delighted to be back in Dublin for all kinds of reasons. It's great to connect with people. I got some shopping done the last couple of days, and especially because when I left New Brunswick, it was minus 15. So this is balmy weather for me. This is lovely this time of year. So thank you for inviting me back, and I would like to be able to share some of the best practices in New Brunswick around inclusive education, things that we've learned along the way, some of the things that we've implemented and continue to work towards. Here we go. So as Jody mentioned, we have had inclusive education legislation since 1986. We call it Bill 85. And then in 2009, we updated our definition of inclusive education. And then in 2013, Policy 322 on inclusive education was released. Amongst all of those milestones, there have been reports on inclusive education, there's been ongoing consultation, but there are several key pieces that stood out, and I wanted to highlight some of those for you. So when we look at our definition of inclusive education and we look at our policy, in particular for us, public education is universal. So the provincial curriculum is provided to all students, and it's done in an inclusive, common learning environment shared among age-appropriate neighborhood peers. The inclusive learning environment, that was one of our biggest shifts in New Brunswick, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute as to why we actually made that shift, that decision. The second is that public education is individualized, so the success of each student depends on the degree to which their programming is developed and looks at their strengths and their weaknesses. And this is probably my favorite part of the policy, so wherever I go, I talk about this piece. The idea that public education is flexible and it's responsive to change. And a few minutes ago, Jody talked about a journey, and it has been a journey for New Brunswick. We're 33 years in, and we certainly have learned a lot of lessons along the way. But it's evolving. It's always evolving. I think if we get to the point as a province, as an education system, if we say, okay, we're done. We've everything around inclusive education is it's all done right now. I think then we're in trouble. We have to look at it as continuing to evolve. So one of the other pieces that talks about the policy is that it reflects some inclusionary practices. So it does ensure learning for all students. It talks about removing barriers to learning, and I'll talk a little bit about universal design for learning in a minute, and some of the ways that we've been able to do that. It promotes the common learning environment. And in 2009, that was a conscious shift for us because we acknowledged that learning occurs in more than just a classroom. It occurs in the hallways, in the playground, in the cafeteria, in the gymnasium. And it was all also with an eye to the idea of the bricks and mortar of a classroom really was falling away. So in the age of technology, many courses, particularly in New Brunswick, all of our high school courses in their last 2 years of high school are available online. With virtual learning, we're actually able to engage in conversations with other jurisdictions and also within our own province. So New Brunswick certainly has urban centers, but we're very rural. And so we have situations in the province where, because of a small rural school, maybe they don't have access to a chemistry lab. But they're being beamed in real time into a larger high school where they're actually completing the chemistry course. So the idea of the bricks and mortar of a classroom really was no longer applicable for us. And it really was about that common learning environment and that it could occur in a multitude of places. That it respects basic legal, civic, and human rights for all students. And again, that it focuses on the individual's strengths and needs. Also in 2009, we looked at what was our definition of inclusive education. So just as Jody talked about the Porto-Aquin report, Strengthening Inclusion, Strengthening Schools, in 2006, there was another report written by Dr. Wayne McKay that looked at inclusive education around the province. And one of the recommendations was to have a cohesive definition of inclusive education. And it took us 3 years to come to that definition and all that it entailed. We brought together our partners, our stakeholders, our rights holders, and we had to come to a consensus and find common ground for moving forward. One of the challenges and one of the aha moments is that even though you're bringing together all of those individuals, it doesn't mean they all agree. And so how do you find that common ground and move forward? And so 3 years later, we actually released our new definition of inclusive education, and it was a much broader definition than we had previously had. Did it still include students with disabilities? Absolutely. But it also looked at all students, our Indigenous learners, or in Canada, our First Peoples or First Nations. It looked at our newcomer students coming into the province. We're small, but we actually accept more newcomers into New Brunswick per capita than any other jurisdiction in the province. It looked at students for low socioeconomic backgrounds, our LGBTQ students, our gifted and talented students, our advanced learners. It was all learners. And it also acknowledged that as individuals, we're multifaceted. So I could have autism, I could be an Indigenous learner, and I could also be new to the province. So again, to have it focused on disability, we needed to expand beyond that. Policy 322 was, there are a lot of game changers, I would say, for New Brunswick and our journey, and Policy 322 was certainly one of them. And it really focused on the intentional removal of barriers. And I'll talk about the intentional. You'll hear that word come up a lot through the next 23 minutes and 40 seconds. The idea that it has to be intentional, it has to be purposeful. But it was the intentional removal of barriers. It was environments that were intentionally designed to have everyone at their best. It's all of us. And so in New Brunswick, we have a 10-year education plan. And I know that can sometimes seem unusual in changing political environments. The idea that we would have an education plan that would actually go beyond a 4-year political cycle, potentially 4-year political cycle. But it was one that we really invested in because our teachers were telling us, just as we get behind something, the political party changes. And then we're not sure which direction we're going in. And so our 10-year education plan, everyone at their best, was released. And even with the recent change in government, it's still a focus for that government. And so that's really important for us. You could almost feel teachers waiting to go beyond that 4-year mark. And once we got past the 4-year mark and that was still the direction, then you could see teachers are more at ease. So it is everyone at their best. Our goal is personalized education where all students are learning in their zone of proximal development, both academically and social and emotionally. But it takes a village to do that. It truly takes a village to do that. And we can't do it by ourselves. I think when an education system tries to take it all on by themselves, then it's exhausting, and that sustainability piece that Jody talked about becomes much more difficult. So I talk about school being the extension of the community, that the community is really the hub, and yes, the school is one extension to that. But within that, it's really important that from consultation, from building relationships, from ongoing conversation. Those of you that may have heard of Fierce Conversations, it's a professional learning for training. The conversation is the relationship, and that's such a key piece. So we work and have worked very closely with our families in New Brunswick, and that is such a key piece. From moving forward and recognizing the strength of families to also listening to their fears and challenges and how do we move forward. The family piece is huge. Student voice. We've gotten a lot better at this. I wish we had done a better job early on when it came to student voice. And there's some really exciting things that I'm hearing are happening in Ireland that I think it would be great lessons for New Brunswick to learn and to take back as well. So that student voice piece is key. Hearing from all students, what's working really well, what are their hopes and dreams, what are their challenges? All students, a cross-section of students. So we just recently had a summit in the province in education, and there was a student panel. And one of the comments that came from the student was that, okay, so we're part of this panel, but we're your high-achieving students. You need to have better representation for student voice. So you need to hear from all students. When I speak to schools about programming and planning for students, Jody talked about PLPs or personalized learning plans. In other jurisdictions, they'd be called SEPs, special education plans, or IEPs. And I talk about the importance of having the students at that table where possible, to be part of those conversations. But even when students can't be at that table, every single day our children are telling us something. So if a student is not able to respond to us verbally, doesn't mean that I have nothing to say. It means that you will need to listen to me with more than just your ears. And every single day, our students are telling us something. So the student voice, we're getting better. We could have done better in the early years. School leadership is key. We know from the research around school leadership that that is one of the defining factors in anything, and that the importance of distributive leadership. Otherwise, regardless of what it is in a school, if that administrator, if that principal or vice principal or headmaster leaves, then there's no guarantee that things will continue. So that student leadership and needing to invest in the student leadership is key. And we talk a lot about how our school leadership has to support our teachers. I don't think we talk about it enough about how we need to support our school leadership themselves. I think that's an important piece. Our educators and paraeducators. And I put educators instead of teachers there because that includes our psychologists, our speech language pathologists. It includes our social workers, and yes, it does include our teachers. Our paraeducators, so in New Brunswick, they would be called educational assistants. You would have your special needs assistant. We have behavior mentors and school intervention workers, and they are such a key piece of the teams. And we actually, when there's professional learning that's embedded in the school, we always say to schools and to districts, absolutely, there will be times when you'll need to do targeted PL for those groups, but as much as possible, you want those individuals doing PL, professional learning, together, because they are the team and they bring a unique lens to those conversations. The next one is early childhood. So in New Brunswick, that would be from birth until age 8. So even though our children start school at age 5, early childhood educators are involved up until age 8 with intervention. And in 2000, and I'm looking at Jody, but I'm going to say probably 10, we had early childhood was sitting with another department, and they moved into the education department. So we're now the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. I think there are so many successes and learnings from early childhood that we could take into our K to grade 12, to secondary system. And so it's really having that relationship. The next piece is advocacy, and that is, I can't emphasize the importance of that. It doesn't mean that we always are in agreement, but the importance of building those relationships with advocacy groups, with family organizations is critical. And a relationship doesn't happen overnight. It does take time, but it allows that relationship to be responsive as opposed to being reactive because there was a situation in a particular school or because something ended up in the media the next day. It really allows for a responsive relationship. I really don't think New Brunswick could be as far in inclusive education if we did not have the family organizations and the advocacy groups working alongside us. It's critical. The next piece is another relationship building one, and that's teacher unions and other unions. And again, this is another situation where we've invested time and effort and years to build those relationships so that we are moving forward. We're in a situation with New Brunswick, with our teachers union and our other unions as well, where we actually co-chair inclusive education steering committees. And that has been something that has evolved over the years. We meet on a regular basis to share concerns, to share ideas and best practices, to share what's happening from both sides. So again, we're not reactive, we're not reacting to a particular crisis, that we've built those relationships and we're able to move forward. Even when we do disagree, that relationship piece is there, which allows us to be able to do that. So in New Brunswick, we have an Inclusive Education Steering Committee. It is co-chaired by 3 groups. So it would be the Department of Education, it is our teachers union, and it is the New Brunswick Association of Community Living, which is one of our strongest organization groups. And we co-chair that together. We do rotating chairs. The committee itself is about 15 people. It includes people from our disability network. It includes our Multicultural Association, someone from the Indigenous Learners. So it really is that inclusive lens for that steering committee. So one of the challenges when you look at some of the research around inclusive education is that the definitions really do vary across the world. Even within Canada, we have 10 provinces and we have 3 territories. And although we all have definitions and frameworks of inclusive education, it looks very different depending on where in the country you are. So that does make research challenging. But in the research that we look at, it does look at very much requiring changes to the organization, to curriculum, to teaching strategies. And when you look at the effective schools research, you can see some of the linkages there. We talk about school culture and organizational qualities, social instructional qualities. We talk about the importance of having a unified vision, shared decision-making, distributive leadership, all things that are really required for inclusive education and other foundational underpinnings to be able to move forward. And it does talk about high-quality instruction, high-quality, job-embedded professional learning. We know that one-off professional learning sessions don't work. The research doesn't support it. And what does work is when there is job-embedded professional learning that occurs at the school level, and that where possible, there's coaching and mentoring to support going forward. Not hitting, there we go. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we have implemented or are continuing to work with in New Brunswick. The first being universal design for learning, and Jody talked about that earlier. So in a nutshell, for those not familiar with it, it really does talk about the upfront planning, the proactive planning that occurs so that students are able to, we look at different ways to engage students, so that students are able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in different ways, and that knowledge and information is presented to them in different ways. And so we have implemented Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, across the province. And we did start with a professional learning session for every educator and paraeducator in the province. We didn't bring them all together. We actually created modules that we were then able to pre-plan with schools who could facilitate those sessions. And out of 7,000 educators, we had almost 5,000 of those educators respond back to the survey and say, okay, here's my next step. Because not everybody is ready to jump in with both feet. So you start from where you are and you move to the next step. And we were actually able to create other types of support and other modules to support them in their understanding of universal design for learning. So we work fairly closely with CAST out of Boston. And the folks at CAST, they are the group that coined Universal Design for Learning, and they're actually visiting New Brunswick in the spring. As we were making, I want to say making the case, but as we were actually talking about systemic implementation of UDL in New Brunswick, it was really important for us and for our educators to see New Brunswick research. So it's great when you see international research and national research, but you really want, as a learner, you want to be able to say and see what's happening in my jurisdiction. So in New Brunswick, we have school improvement review. And that's where our schools go through a review process. And we have indicators for inclusive education and for a number of things as well. And we were able to say to them, you know what, when it comes to these parts of universal design for learning, we knock it out of the park. When it comes to graphic organizers and visuals, and we have it nailed. When it comes to some of those engagement pieces and the planning and the self-assessment that our students need to do, we had some work to do. But we were able to use New Brunswick data for that. And then we were actually able to reach out to schools and say, we'd like to do some action research. So what does it look like in your classroom? If you happen to be a phys ed teacher and you're teaching 5-year-olds, or you are a history teacher in high school, or a math teacher, what does it look like? So we actually created a research monograph, and it is available on our website, and it really does bring together the research of how to implement universal design for learning in New Brunswick schools. And we wanted the good, the bad, and the ugly. What's working really well? What's not working? Since then, we've actually taken on a second cohort, and the second version of the monograph will be published in the winter. The Education Support Services team, so Jody talked about that. And at every school, there is a school-based education support services team. Some jurisdictions would call them student services teams. And those teams are made up of an administrator, it's our resource teacher or special education teacher, it's the guidance counselor. That's the bare minimum. Other schools have other people as part of that team. And that team, their role is to really help support classroom teachers, to be able to problem solve and to make decisions. I'm going to go to the next one. There we go. One of the documents that we developed really was about using education support services teams, those school-based teams, to support inclusive education. And how do we do that? So that was important. We set parameters around those teams. They have to meet every 10 days. Most of them actually choose to meet every week. They have to take minutes. There are certain key indicators as to whether or not they're a highly functioning team. And we would hear from classroom teachers, well, I know there's an ESS team over here, but it's not really my team. That belongs to the resource teacher and the guidance counselor. And we'd say, no, that's the school-based team. That is your team. You have a vested interest in ensuring that that team is working really well. So that was important. We have a coaching model. And so if we're going to, and you're going to look at having support for classroom teachers, what does that look like? So there's a coaching model where resource teachers and classroom teachers work together, and there's coaching that's happening. Nobody needs to be an expert in everything. They both bring an expertise to the table, and they're working together to support a child or the children within that classroom. New Brunswick has a response to intervention model, or RTI. And when a lot of jurisdictions talk about response to intervention, they immediately go to the 3 tiers, the triangle, and absolutely that's part of our model. But in New Brunswick, it includes all these other pieces. RTI, or response to intervention, won't work if there isn't data, if there isn't fidelity and integrity of instruction, if there isn't progress monitoring. Why are we waiting sometimes that it's a full semester or it's a year and students are not making progress? How do we intervene sooner? PABIS is another foundational piece to our system, so positive behavioral intervention and supports, and that's a key piece. We are starting to look, Jody talked about complex behavior, and we're looking at a strategy around complex behavior. Foundational to that will be PBIS, because we're never going to be able to meet the students with higher intensity needs if we're not able to address the school-wide and the class-wide. And then the other piece is integrated service delivery. So we had several commission reports that taught in New Brunswick that in 2008, 2010, that really talked about that that departments were disjointed. They weren't communicating, that students were going before the court system or the hospital system, and assessments were being replicated, that parents were having to tell their stories multiple times. So we created the integrated service delivery model. And that is to allow students to receive services around mental health concerns and support. There is a wraparound team. Each department, the Department of Health, Social Development, which would be like Family and Children's Services, Education, and Public Safety, gave funding, gave staff, and they've created child and youth teams. When a request for service is made to that team, that support is provided in the schools, in the home, and in the community to those families. It is a wraparound support. It is no more families needing to tell their story multiple times. Every member of the child and youth team sits on an education support services team. And so that linkage is there, and that sharing of information is there. When we started, we really thought that we would see a lot of requests for services or referrals for high school students. And you know what? We did. But what shocked us is that the majority of the requests for services were for 9 to 11-year-olds. So when you look at that, when you look at anxiety, when you look at depression, when you look at resiliency, we were seeing our 9 to 11-year-olds were a key factor there. We had some challenges early on, because you bring together 4 departments and you say, go collaborate, become a team. And it doesn't happen that easy. You had education who was talking about, we're all students. And then you had other departments going, yeah, but if you happen to have autism and you've got some mental health needs, we don't provide service. As an education system, we said, no, that's a non-negotiable. If you need some support, you need some additional professional learning, we'll get that for you. but you don't get to exempt children because they have a disability. And so that was a key piece for us. We've been doing some work recently with Jonathan Weiss out of Toronto, and Jonathan does a lot of research around mental health needs of children and youth with disabilities. And he will say the professionals already have the bulk of the learning that they need. You may need to top them up a bit, but you don't need to create a whole other classification of professionals to deal with mental health needs for students who happen to have disabilities. I did want to talk about some, as Anne said, I'm about to defend my dissertation next month, yay, which is very exciting for so many reasons. And I did promise my husband that this will be the last Christmas that I will be studying, so that will be good. And so I had worked with healthy and inclusive high schools in New Brunswick, so they had to have performed high on indicators of inclusive education, as well as on comprehensive school health. And I worked with them over 6 months. And there were some findings that jumped out at me, and I really thought there would be a lot of focus on students, and there absolutely was. And there were lots of things that came out of the data. It was very rich. But a couple key things that came out that were unique to these 5 schools. One was that they intentionally focused on the zone of proximal development and learning for adults in the building. Not everybody needed the same thing. Sometimes it needed to be school-wide. Sometimes it needed to be very targeted in a particular area for an adult, not just teacher. So they very much focused on that. The second piece is when you look at the DC and Ryan Carr model, which talks about competency and autonomy and relatedness, and talks about it in terms of students and workplace, not a lot on the school as the workplace. But what came out from the research was that before we even get to students having that competency that they have the skill set to be able to do their work, and that they have voice and choice, that relatedness is the underpinning. To build those relationships, to build that sense of connectedness, that is key. And so if we really want to get to a truly inclusive system, we do have to invest in the adults, in their wellness, in their relationships, in their connectedness, in their resiliency. That is a key piece, and it is an underpinning. Some comments from our participants, and I'm watching I've got a little under 3 minutes. So these are comments from the participants. Of course, our focus is always the students, but a healthy school is when we all feel included, and we're working towards the same purpose. Without relationships, you have the illusion of support. The priority is connecting with the student. Curriculum comes second. It is not just FTE, full-time equivalent positions. All the teachers won't help if the right teachers and structures are not in place. Places grow from disagreement. It is healthy, it is respectful. We don't run from it. You can have different viewpoints and people who challenge. It's how we get better. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the other pieces that we're doing. We talked about the school indicators, the inclusion indicators that we talk about. We do have, for our personalized learning plans, we do reviews on those, quality assurance reviews, and that helps give data to be able to direct future support and direction. We look at student engagement. We have parent, student, teacher perception surveys, and we talked about the wraparound support, the integrated service delivery data, and the wellness piece is so key for our students, for our children and youth, our educators, and our families as well. The last piece I will leave you with is New Brunswick, as I said, has been on this journey for 33 years now. Doesn't mean that as you move forward that your system will look exactly like New Brunswick. You have your own context, you have your own strengths, and you're looking to create something that speaks to Ireland. One of the challenges, if we could go back in time, when you take a system and you make changes to one and you're not making changes to the other, it's going to take you a lot longer to get to where you're going. So you will, whatever direction you decide to move in, you're going to create something new, and it's going to be the best of both worlds, and that's really important. When I did my data collection, I expected I would have a lot of special education teachers or guidance teachers be my participants. I had 3 out of 21. And when I went back to those schools, I said, why? I'm curious. And that was my own bias going in. And the classroom teachers across the board said, why wouldn't it be us? They're our students. And so that's the shift. We had a delegation from Australia recently come in, And they were having a tour at one of the schools with a grade 5 student. And one of the visitors said to the student, and in particular was about another young student with a disability, a visible disability, and said, "Does your teacher talk to you about, so-and-so and their disability?" And he went, "Why would they? We've been together since preschool. That's just..." So it really is. It's shifting the conversation sometimes. It's really the importance of listening to other voices of our children, our youth, our families. As I said in the beginning, we can't do it alone. It is a journey, and it is a partnership going forward. And so I do wish you all the best as you take your next steps.